Welcome to this video on Goldilocks intervention as part of the judge training program, where we'll discuss how judges should neither intervene too much or too little and instead try and obtain just the right amount of judgment in performing their duties. A good judge is neither too passive and ends up accepting everything a team says to be true, nor are they too active and intrude based on their superior skill or knowledge to determine the winner, and that's why we're making reference to the Goldilocks principle. The analogy here is to virtue ethics, where too little courage is something like cowardice, where that's not a good trait that you want to have. But equally, having too much courage is foolhardiness, and that's not great either. So judges need to be conscious of this at all times and make sure they are not overstepping by intervening too much or understepping by not intervening when necessary in order to judge the debate as their role calls for. I want to discuss this in broadly three areas, under which we'll discuss some examples of good and bad intervention and how you as a judge should approach situations where you might need to intervene. Let's start by talking about interventions in arguments and responses. Bad interventions can happen in one of two ways. First, it can be over-intervening. For example, using your spec knowledge or saying that an argument is not plausible because you have no experience of it being true prior to this. It can also include setting an unreasonable burden for a team that is not based on the choice of argument that the team is making. In other words, saying to them as a judge that they had to prove more than they actually sought out to prove. On the other hand, it can also include under-intervention. For instance, if a judge thinks that a premise in an argument is frankly implausible, but was not explicitly challenged, say, by the opening team in a point of information, the right response would not be to say that the argument stands in its entirety simply because it wasn't challenged by a team on the other side. So what does good intervention look like? Well, for instance, it could be a case where a judge points out that the logical reasons offered by a team simply don't result in the chosen conclusion of their case being true. Or observing that the premise used or the characterization used is so implausible to most people, including the average reasonable person, that the claim is less persuasive than it could have been and perhaps that the team thinks it actually is in the debate. So what I want to do is give you some questions to think about when deciding how much you need to intervene in an argument. The first question is to ask yourself, given what a team has said, how likely is it that their conclusion is true? Now, to do this, you don't want to bring in any responses or rebuttal or any knowledge you might have that weakens the argument. Simply, it is to ask yourself, based on the logic that a team has offered, how confident are you that the promises and the outcomes that they are selling are going to happen in the world? The second question is to ask yourself, what were they trying to prove in the first place? And to extrapolate or to think about the burdens of their case, not in terms of what you think they should have done, but to think in terms of what is required in order to prove the argument that they are trying to go for. So for instance, if a team was trying to show that some people will do something and that will hurt the efficacy of the motion, then it's sufficient for them to show that only some will do this, and that if they don't even show a majority or all, that doesn't weaken the case that they're trying to run because it's not the burden they're trying to take on. But there are other arguments that are different. Some arguments say that all people must be given the right to do something, or all people will benefit in a particular way. So in those situations, you would justifiably say that if a team doesn't prove all, then they shouldn't get credit for trying to prove that all people will be affected in a particular way. That doesn't mean their case is irrelevant. It just means that you need to accurately determine for yourself as a judge how much they actually proved and whether that significantly weakens their case or whether it weakens it somewhat but not enough to make them suffer in the round. So here is then a guiding rule of thumb that summarizes what we've discussed. As a judge, you should be open-minded to arguments that you might not have heard before or conclusions that you might not have previously thought about before. But at the same time, you should have a bullshit test. You should constantly be asking yourself if the logic that you are being offered is plausible or whether it requires further justification, whether the logic actually delivers on those outcomes, whether it actually persuades you that those outcomes are true, or whether they are simply statements that are loosely related to the conclusions that are being drawn. You should be fair at all times to what teams do prove. It might not be everything they set out to prove, and they might have only proven a fraction of that, but that fraction might not be zero either, and they might still be able to win the debate by showing a significant portion of the claim, even if it is not all of it. In other words, don't think of claims as being proven to either a maximum or minimum extent. There are shades of gray in between, and your job as a judge is to try and figure out precisely, or as precisely as possible, what a team has managed to achieve. Let's move on to the second area where judge intervention is sometimes required, where we'll make use of the same guiding principle and hopefully help you understand that even better. So what happens when teams disagree about facts and there are factual disputes in the round? Well, bad intervention might be when a judge uses specific knowledge that they came into the debate with to weaken or strengthen the claims of either side. Good intervention is allowing teams to provide logical reasons and characterizations or to build a web of collaborating evidence in support of their factual claims. And failing that, a judge can default to what the average reasonable person would know in order to pass judgment on the debate. Who is the average reasonable person? Well, this question has been answered many times, and the consensus is that this is someone who reads international headlines for a prolonged period of time, who understands the direction the world is heading in, but not necessarily the specifics of every single region and every single issue in the world. If you're uncertain about how to resolve a factual dispute, prior to intervening as a judge, you should ask yourself, is this intervention required? Does this factual dispute matter? How much does resolving this dispute weaken or strengthen the clash or the arguments that are happening thus far? I think it is more obvious to judges that it is a bad thing to use or bring in specialist knowledge to evaluate an argument. But what I want to do is discuss the opposite edge case. What happens if there is a fact that significantly weakens the premise of an argument, and this fact is something that the average reasonable person would know? So for instance, the average person would know that the global economy is in a state of shutdown because of the COVID-19 pandemic and its ramifications worldwide. So if a team chooses to, at this particular point in time, make an argument that says the global economy is thriving and hence it is a good time to do the motion for certain reasons, can a judge use this knowledge in order to intervene in this argument, and how should they do so? I think the short answer is yes, because if a team doesn't do the additional logical work to overcome a very basic fact about the world at the moment, they do become less persuasive about their conclusion. But again, you don't want to over-intervene. So if they do offer good reasons why this is a good time to invest or to expand globally, those reasons can still be of some use, but it raises the argumentative burden of proof. The COVID-19 knowledge that you do have as a reasonable person does allow you to say that, on balance, the contribution offered is perhaps not as strong as another team, or it doesn't beat out another team. But that doesn't by itself invalidate or make you ignore the reasons that they've offered. And in theory, if they had done that analysis really well, then it could still be sufficient to overcome this fact that you know. But my point here is that that fact that you have as an average reasonable person is something that you can use to evaluate the persuasiveness of a claim within the debate, even if no other team in the debate explicitly raises it. To go back to the guiding principle in the last chapter, this fact that you are using has to be glaringly obvious if you are indeed using it as the average reasonable person. Before you do this, always be aware that you might be applying specialist knowledge, and really try and ask yourself what the average person would know about the state of the world. Crucially, you should also try and see if any other team has implied or explicitly argued this, because if a team has, then you're simply not intervening by using this knowledge, you're instead referring on something that is already in the debate. You should, as always, step in at the last possible stage and as minimally as possible, but to do so in a way that is fair to all teams and to the arguments they have chosen to make. Finally, I want to talk about judge intervention in the context of weighing up issues in the debate. In one of our other videos by Enting Lee, we've talked about why we should default to what teams do when they are able to justify and use their own criteria. In those cases, you should not intervene. But what happens in the absolute last resort, where no one agrees on a criteria and no one argues for it well, and everyone talks past each other? Well, those debates still have to be judged and have to have a result, and that is your job as a judge to formulate. So if you do have to intervene, that intervention should be as minimal as possible. In other words, you should be guided by what the average reasonable person not just knows or thinks, but what the average reasonable person feels is important about the world we live in. You should use a fairly broad, reasonable, and intuitive metric about what matters in the real world to the average person on the street if you were to ask them about this issue. And based on the concerns or the priorities of the average reasonable person, you can use those concerns to weigh up the arguments that are made. To be clear, that doesn't benefit one team or another necessarily. It just means that you're using that method of judging the debate to evaluate the contributions that all teams have made. But to be clear, this should always be done as a last resort, and it should always be done as minimally as possible. One final piece of advice from me before you start applying these principles. Whenever you are explaining the result of a debate in which you did have to intervene, be very clear to the teams why you did so and why you were bound by the debate to do so as a last resort. Teams sometimes go away thinking that judges have unfairly penalized them, and so it's very important to be clear why the precise arguments made and the precise choices made led to a situation where you had to intervene and how you chose to do so in a way that was as reasonable as possible. Some teams will inevitably disagree, but if you are doing so in this fashion, then I'd say that's the mark of a responsible and probably ideal judge to have. So to summarize what we've discussed, good judging is about striking a delicate balance in terms of how critical you are towards a team's case. You should make sure you're not overly critical by denying them credit for the things that they have proven, and similarly, you should make sure you're not being overly generous and giving credit for things which are simply unpersuasive or unintuitive or have not been proven well. If you keep asking yourself these questions in a debate and as you judge debates going forward, you'll quickly become better at figuring out instances where you should apply the rules in one way and the rules in another. And finally, if you explain to teams why you were in this situation and how you made these interventions, teams will have a much clearer idea of how the debate's result was justified and also be able to improve on their debating going forward. So best of luck in trying these principles out, and I hope they're helpful.